All right, APUSH students, here we are for the second half of the Cold War notes. Last time that we talked, we were looking at President Truman and how he sort of was responsible for starting the Cold War a little bit, and more directly, we were looking at some of the domestic stuff going on at home. We talked about Truman's reelection in 1948 and his proposal of what he called the Fair Deal, and this is right about where we left off. So Truman's second term in office, his first actual real term that he won on his own, is going to really wind up being dominated by some foreign events, and specifically by the Korean War itself. So this is Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, and Truman and Acheson together are largely going to be responsible for pushing the involvement of the U.S. and the United Nations in what is going to become the Korean War. So the setup in Korea for the Korean War itself is a little bit similar to what we've talked about in Germany recently, in that the country of Korea had been conquered by, or was a territory of Japan's, and had been for a generation or so. And so after World War II, it winds up being split or divided in occupation. The northern part of Korea, of course, is occupied by sort of the Communist Party and Communist allied forces. And the southern part of Korea is occupied by a nationalist U.S.-backed government headed by a guy named Syngman Rhee. The leader of Communist North Korea was Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current leader of North Korea. So sort of a generational dynasty thing going on there at this point. So from 1945 until about 1950, Korea was a divided territory, right, as it is today. And then in June of 1950, the Communist Army of North Korea is going to leave Pyongyang and is going to invade across this treaty line. This sort of 38th parallel is the kind of famous dividing line between North and South Korea. And they're going to try to invade Korea, or as they would have said, they're going to try to reunite Korea as a completely communist country. The United Nations is going to look at this. Remember, the United Nations has only been around for like 3 or 4 years at this point. So they're going to look at this and they basically decide that this is a violation of the new UN Charter, which says that countries shouldn't invade each other and that they should respect each other's borders. The Soviet Union does not happen to be at this meeting of the United Nations. They're angry because we didn't give the People's Republic of China China's seat. So they're boycotting. They're not there to veto the action. And so the United Nations is going to vote to call up an international peacekeeping force, basically an army made up of troops from a bunch of member countries in the United Nations. The United States is like the driving force here, so we're going to provide about 88% of the force, and that's what the Korean War is. The Korean War is not a war that the United States government declares. It's not the U.S. Army technically fighting the war. It's U.S. troops, but it's U.S. troops as part of a UN peacekeeping force, sort of part of a little bit of our new way of doing business post-war. So by the time the UN takes any sort of action, the communists have pushed pretty far. You're looking at this sort of orange lines here. They've pushed pretty far and they've taken Seoul. They're kind of down here. And the UN is going to land their troops at Pusan down here in the south, and they're going to start to push north pretty directly. So it's almost like this little teeter-totter. The communist troops invade the south. The UN troops land and they're going to push back. And then the question by October of this year is basically, are we going to stop once we've pushed the Koreans back over this 38th parallel line, or are we going to keep going? Like, are we going to actually invade North Korea itself? And the decision is made to invade North Korea. So the UN troops continue to push forward past the 38th parallel and into North Korea. And it's at this point that China, the People's Republic of China, comes in on the side of North Korea, and they push back. And we're going to wind up finding ourselves in, by late 1950, basically, in a pretty much a stalemate, right, around the center of the country. So we wind up getting kind of stuck. We can't really move too far in any direction. The other side doesn't move too far in any direction. You have South Korea backed by the United Nations, North Korea backed by China. Both sides have like some strength there. The Chinese are kind of lurking over the Yalu River here. And we enter a period of basically stalemate. Fighting continues, but neither side is advancing very much, kind of like the Western Front in France during World War I. So it's somewhat of a similar situation there. While the war is sort of stalling out, President Truman is going to get into a somewhat undignified fight with the main general in Korea, and that's Douglas MacArthur, who you see on the screen there, chomping on his characteristic pipe. MacArthur was kind of a hard-charging, like guy's guy of a general, not very tactful in any way. The controversial, as the slide says. he's the one who makes the decision kind of unilaterally to push across the 38th parallel, and he really doesn't think much of Truman. Truman, remember, doesn't have any military experience. MacArthur's like a long-time World War II vet, and he just thinks Truman's kind of weak and not very like military knowledgeable. And so he kind of publicly disparages Truman. He gives speeches where he talks about how we're weak if we don't use the bomb on Korea and all that kind of stuff. And so finally in April of 1951, Truman is forced to essentially fire him. So it's definitely the right decision. You can't, if you're the commander-in-chief, you can't have your general out there bad-mouthing you. But it doesn't really look good. People don't like this. MacArthur is pretty popular with the American public. The war is kind of stalled out. None of this looks or feels very good for Truman. And so that's kind of the situation that we're at when the 1952 election rolls around. Truman has served 2 terms, one of his own and then basically all of FDR's. So he's out pretty much, and he's going to get the guy that the Democrats get to try to replace him is Adlai Stevenson, who's just very much kind of a old school, New Deal Democrat, somebody who's very kind of like in the FDR line. The Republicans, on the other hand, are going to successfully woo the big deal general from World War II who had masterminded the D-Day invasion, and that is Dwight David Eisenhower. Eisenhower is a really good continuation of this line of presidents we've seen since George Washington, of presidents who have military experience but not necessarily governmental experience. So that would be like Washington, Andrew Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant. We have Eisenhower here, right? Those are presidents who have military experience but not political experience beforehand. Eisenhower's vice president is going to be a young politician by the name of Richard Nixon. This is him here looking very young, and he was young when he was vice president. He's going to be around for a while, as you might know. And at this point, the Democrats have been in charge of the country for kind of a long time, right? Since Roosevelt took over, and started the New Deal in 1933. It's been 20 years at this point. So the time seems to be due for sort of a change. So Eisenhower runs this very kind of populist campaign. The 1952 election is really the first one where we're going to see television commercials play any sort of role. So we're actually going to take a quick pause on the notes here, and I'm going to play you guys probably one of the most famous political cartoons. You may have potentially run into this in civics when you talked about propaganda there. We go to a quick website called Living Room Candidate, and we're going to watch this commercial, and I'd like you to think about while this is playing what it is that this commercial, which I need to refresh for, is going to tell you about the Eisenhower administration. Like, what does this tell you about what Eisenhower stands for? Let me take a pause while I get. Okay, success. So here's this 1952-56. It's called I Like Ike. It's a really, really famous, probably the most well-known campaign commercial from the early 1950s. Again, keep in mind, this was right after people were starting to get televisions. This was a new technology. So it's kind of one of the first times that we see this idea of television influencing the campaign. And your goal is to watch this commercial, which is only a minute long, and try to decide what it is that you now know about Eisenhower. So here we go.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John
or Dean
or Harry, let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep, get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going, travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way, we'll all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington, we'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president.
Okay, so if you didn't just enjoy that cartoon elephant standing for Ike, we probably can't be friends. But what you should have gotten out of that is that it's not a lot of substance. It's not like you now know in detail what Eisenhower's foreign policy was, right? It's very much a campaign of personality. It's not saying, here's what Eisenhower is going to do for you, or here's how Eisenhower is going to conduct the Cold War. It just says, we like Ike, Everybody likes Ike. Milkmaids like Ike. Babies like Ike, right? Very much like a populist type campaign, and it's very successful. People expect that as a military general, that Eisenhower will have the ability to end the Korean War relatively quickly. Here's the 1952 electoral map, so you can see how successful I Like Ike was as a campaign slogan. Very, very successful. So Eisenhower is pretty much immediately after taking office in January of 1953, is going to forward a little bit here, is going to bring a pretty quick end to the Korean stalemate. So again, he comes in office in January of 53, and by July of 1953, there's been a truce signed. So that really doesn't take too long. The truce itself is basically going to restore the exact same borders that existed before, and this is still the truce that exists today. It's worth noting that it is just a truce. It's not actually an end of the war. Technically, North Korea and South Korea are still in a state of war. They just haven't actually exchanged fire since the 1950s. And this is also when there's still a pretty large amount of American troops who are stationed in Korea, in Seoul for the most part, and in Panmunjom a little bit as well. So we're still very much active in this region as a result of our involvement in the Korean War. To me, the Korean War is a little bit like the War of 1812 in the sense that it ends with a resolution that it's not a clear victory. Like, we don't really gain anything, but we don't lose anything either, right? We succeed at containing communism. Communism does not spread, right, even if we don't really push it back at all. So that's sort of the end of the Korean War. Right around the same time that Eisenhower becomes president, the Soviet Union gains a new premier as well. Stalin finally dies, and Khrushchev comes in, and he's, as you can see, premier is the Soviet equivalent of the president. So he's premier from 1953 to 64. So that's basically going to be all of Eisenhower's presidency, and then Kennedy's as well, in the first year of Johnson's presidency before Khrushchev dies off. So it's just a good name to know. Khrushchev is a little bit more diplomatic than Stalin was. He's a little easier to work with. We're going to see some of the militarism of the Stalin years step down just a little bit under Khrushchev. So Truman and Eisenhower both are very committed to containment, but they're committed to containment in very different ways, right? I mentioned in the first part of these notes that every U.S. president during the Cold War was going to have kind of their own version of containment. And in fact, this little setup that you guys see on the slide here is something that we're going to be building out until it eventually encompasses all 9 of the presidents. So you're going to be seeing this get bigger and longer as we compare different types of containment policy. So for right now, we're taking a look at Truman versus Eisenhower. Oh, by the way, this is this whole comparing of containment policy thing. It's a very common compare and contrast for a test. That'd be a good thing to get down. So the Truman style of containment is very focused on traditional warfare. It's about putting military in places, using our Air Force to, ship in supplies to Berlin, using our military to fight a war in Korea, tanks, boots on the ground, that type of stuff. Very, very kind of World War II style warfare, right? That's really what Truman is about. Eisenhower, on the other hand, who you might think would be really into traditional warfare since he was a World War II general, is much more into almost like nuclear maneuvering. He calls it the new look, and he's going to trim down or shrink down the size of the Army and the size of the Navy, and focus instead on building up our nuclear weapons stockpile. All throughout the 1950s, while Eisenhower is president, we are building nuclear weapons and testing nuclear weapons really extensively. It's what's sometimes called MAD, mutually assured destruction. The idea is that if we are strong enough to annihilate the Soviet Union and they are strong enough to annihilate us, then then both sides are kind of almost forced to negotiate. We're also going to focus during the Eisenhower years a lot on covert operations and the use of the CIA, which we'll talk about, and economic alliances. CETO is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. CENTO is the Central European Treaty Organization. So we're trying to kind of make alliances in the Third World and edge out the Soviet Union to gain, I guess you could say, leverage or ground. So Truman's more about traditional style warfare. The Eisenhower containment is more about nuclear maneuvering and intelligence and that type of warfare. With Khrushchev in, things do change a little bit. You guys can kind of take a look at this at your leisure, but we are going to step back away a little bit from above ground nuclear testing. We're going to stop being quite as aggressive about some of the containment stuff, etc. But the main thing that you need to know about Eisenhower and how he handles the Cold War is really his use of the CIA. CIA is a new organization. It's only been around since 1947. And Eisenhower is really the first president to kind of define its strategies and to make any use of it. And he specifically is going to use the CIA not just to gather intelligence, which is what it like largely does today, gathers intelligence in foreign countries. But he's also going to use it almost as like a little paramilitary organization, or an organization that can conduct sort of small scale like raids and things like that in other countries. Eisenhower uses the CIA to prop up governments that are not communist and that are allied with the United States, even if they're maybe not necessarily very good governments, or governments that treat their citizens very well. And then he's also going to use it to try to secretly topple governments that are communist, even if those communist governments were elected like by the people. So we use the CIA essentially as a covert or a secret arm in our containment war in ways that are going to wind up kind of coming back around to bite us in the butt basically in the coming decade. So a couple of areas in the world where the CIA is used during Eisenhower. So in 1953, for example, in the Philippines, which was formerly a U.S. colony, but by this point is a free country, it gains its freedom in 1946, I believe. And so by 1953, the Philippines are ready for an election. The United States is going to influence, is the nice way of saying it, or we're going to pretty much direct the election away from a communist-leaning candidate and towards a pro-U.S. candidate. In Latin America, in Guatemala in 1954, there's a communist-leaning president who's pretty popular and freely elected, and we're going to use the CIA to stage an internal coup, topple him, and replace him with a dictator, Arbenz, who is not very good on civil rights, but is pro-U.S. and not communist. Also in Latin America in the 1950s in Puerto Rico, there is an anti-American independence movement going on. Remember, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, and there's a group of people at the time who were looking to make it into an independent country, specifically a communist independent country, so we squashed that one. In the Middle East, a big one. It's got a lot of long-term consequences. In 1953, there's an elected president of Iran who has oil policies essentially that are very favorable to the United States, and we are going to help stage a coup and overthrow him and replace him with the guy who's going to become known as the Shah of Iran, who will be in place for quite a while, is perceived as a dictator, and is later going to be the kind of background of what becomes the Iranian hostage crisis in the 1970s. So that the general pattern you should be getting, even if you don't have the specific details down, is that, again, we're using the CIA all around the world to support governments that are sort of favorable to us, and to topple governments that aren't, even when they don't maybe necessarily meet the greatest of like civil rights standards. The probably most famous place where the CIA is going to get involved to our potential detriment is in Cuba. In January of 1959, Fidel Castro, a young revolutionary, is going to stage a successful and kind of surprising communist revolution in Cuba. The U.S. had supported the regime of a guy named Fulgencio Batista, and we had been supporting the Cuban government since right after the Spanish-American War, right? We kind of made Cuba into almost like a protectorate of the United States. And so this really upsets us, right? Cuba is only 90 miles off the U.S. coast. So the idea of having like a communist stronghold right off of our border is not something we're very happy about. And this is in the last year of the Eisenhower presidency, and especially during JFK, this is going to become an issue. When we talk about Kennedy, we'll talk about that in some more detail for JFK. The other area of the world that's going to be kind of long-term and upcoming importance that starts, our involvement starts during the Eisenhower presidency, is of course in Southeast Asia, and then in what's going to become called Vietnam. So this whole like red outlined area, this is what was referred to as French Indochina. It had been a territory of France for a while at this point, and there's been a series of independence revolutions. And then in 1954, there's a battle called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the French forces are finally defeated by freedom fighters in French Indochina. The country of French Indochina is dissolved and becomes three independent countries, the countries of, that you can see here, where's my cursor? There. Countries of Vietnam, right, sort of long, skinny, and pink right here, and then Laos, right, in green, and Cambodia. So Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia emerge in the 1950s, and in 1954, after the French leave, the Geneva Accords are going to separate Vietnam into two countries, North Vietnam, the capital of which is Hanoi, right there, and then South Vietnam, the capital of which is you see labeled as Ho Chi Minh City on here, but it was called Saigon up until the 1970s. So Saigon and Hanoi, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. This is the point, 1954 under Eisenhower. this is the point when the United States first becomes involved in Vietnam. We're going to send in military advisors to South Vietnam, largely because of something called the domino theory. We are kind of convinced that Vietnam, if you take a look at it, it kind of makes sense why, that Vietnam is like the key domino in the row of dominoes, and that if South Vietnam falls to communism, that all of these other countries will come with it, that Laos will become communist, and Cambodia, and Thailand, and Burma, and on and towards India. So the concern is that if we allow South Vietnam to fall to communism, that we will that will sort of trigger a landslide, a domino, landslide in Southeast Asia. So here in 1954 is when we first start to send military advisors into Vietnam. It's going to be about a decade before our involvement in the Vietnam War starts, but this is the kind of the beginning of that. Overall, the whole CIA involved in the Third World thing doesn't go very well. By the end of Eisenhower's presidency, there's some really strong ill will towards the U.S., and we are going to kind of back off a bit. By the time we hit like 1959 or so, we've stopped being quite so heavy-handed with our usage of the CIA. Meanwhile, back at home, other things going on in the Eisenhower presidency domestically. I mentioned last time the fact that the Cold War, that the Red Scare was going on very heavily, and we talked about like the Taft-Hartley Act and the trials of like the Rosenbergs and the HUAC investigations in the House. The last big gasp of the second Red Scare, in the early 1950s, is what we call McCarthyism. So this guy here is Senator Joseph McCarthy. He was a junior senator from Wisconsin who basically decided that he could sort of ride the fears of the Red Scare into a strong degree of political power. He gives a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he claims to have a list of names of people who work inside the U.S. State Department who are active members of the Communist Party of the United States. He never shows anybody the list, but he uses this claim to force the creation of several, a Senate investigative committee, basically, and they call a bunch of people up in front of this investigative committee to try to root out these supposed communists, lurking in the U.S. State Department. I don't know if you guys have read the play The Crucible by Arthur Miller. It's a pretty common English class read. You may have read it. If you haven't, you probably will encounter it at some point in your academic career. And The Crucible focuses around the Salem witchcraft trials, and it's the whole way that people would accuse, their neighbors of being witches, largely so that they wouldn't get accused themselves. The play The Crucible was written by a guy named Arthur Miller, and Arthur Miller wrote the play The Crucible after being called up in front of the Senate hearings to be investigated as a suspected communist, and the whole thing is basically a thinly veiled metaphor for McCarthyism, which was frequently referred to as a witch hunt. The idea was that, McCarthy would call you up and they would question you, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And you either said no and you looked guilty, or you could tag someone else. You could say, well, I wasn't, but, my friend Joe Smith over there, I saw him going into a meeting once, and then they call up Joe Smith. So it sort of feeds on itself, and it feeds on people's fear of being labeled subversive, and, losing their job maybe. Again, remember, like I said with HUAC, it's not illegal to be a member of the Communist Party. You can join a political party. And so it's not like people are being thrown in jail or tortured or anything, but losing reputations, losing jobs, etc. McCarthyism continues pretty strong on kind of the wave of public fear up until about early 1954, at which point, having found zero communists in the State Department, he decides to redirect his attention to the Army. And they broadcast several, about a month or so, as you can see on there, of hearings in the Army, and it just really makes McCarthy look bad. It becomes clear that he doesn't have any actual evidence, and that he's just sort of preying on people's fears. And as hysterias kind of do, it just sort of dies down. The Congress kind of looks around and is like, hey, why are we listening to this guy? They censure him, which is pretty much the most you can do to any elected official. In December of 1954, he loses his re-election campaign, and within 5 years is pretty much literally dead of alcoholism. He dies of cirrhosis within just a few years. So McCarthy has a very quick rise and a very rapid fall out of popularity. But McCarthyism is the sort of Senate wing of the second Red Scare, and it's a real common test question. I can pretty much promise you guys that when you take the unit test at the end of this unit, you will have a question about McCarthyism, so that's a good thing to pay attention to. A couple of other kind of random Eisenhower things. In 1955, we have what I've mentioned a couple times, and that's the merger of the two largest labor unions in the country into the AFL-CIO. So it's kind of a small but important side note there. And then particularly important piece of legislation that's signed by Eisenhower is the Federal Aid Highway Act, creates pretty much the modern day interstate system in the United States. Interstates are large freeways that go, between more than one state, hence interstate. So if you've ever driven up like I-95 or I-85, both of those are interstates that were built with Eisenhower interstate money. 25 billion over 20 years, that's a tremendous amount. And remember, Eisenhower's a Republican, right? And they're not so into spending a lot of money in general. But so he rationalizes it and gets it through Congress on the argument, basically, that it's a Cold War argument that we need these interstates to be able to move our troops around the country in case of some sort of war. So if you look at Eisenhower interstates, all of the overpasses are built at a height that would allow tanks to pass underneath them, etc. So they're built a tremendous domestic boon to the United States, the building of these interstates, but it's done with the excuse, I guess you could say, of like military preparedness. Yeah, the question that the Federal Interstate Act and several other acts raise is this question of basically like, is Eisenhower really a true conservative? Is Eisenhower really a Republican? Remember, he didn't really have any political experience before he became president, and he wasn't really a vocal, political advocate or anything like that. And it's during the Eisenhower administration that something starts that's a really, really important through thread for kind of the rest of this class, and that is the beginnings of the rise of the conservative movement. So if you are yourself a modern-day conservative, or if you know people who are, the modern-day conservative movement, like people who look to, say, Ronald Reagan and really see that as kind of the ideal of a politician and of political ideals, people who look at, like, say, Paul Ryan as a really good modern-day example of someone with these, what we would consider kind of conservative views. Where that really starts is in kind of backlash against Eisenhower and his moderate republicanism. There was this small but growing group of conservatives who looked at Eisenhower's republicanism and said, you know what, this isn't really that much different than the Democrats. It's too big government. We need to have more local control. We need to have more control of schools. We need to go more states' rights. And this new conservatism is very popular in an area of the country that's referred to as the Sun Belt. And the Sun Belt is basically, kind of what you would think if you think about the term Sun Belt. It's the south part of the United States, especially the Southwest. So states like Arizona and Texas, Southern California, like Florida, are going to start to become much more populous. People are going to move down into the Sun Belt in the 1950s and 1960s. And in general, those are going to prove to be a fairly conservative area of the country. Two names that you need to associate with the early conservative movement. So people who might come up as examples of like pre-Ronald Reagan early conservatives. One of the guys is William F. Buckley Jr., founded a magazine called the National Review that's basically kind of the centerpiece of conservative thought politics for a long time. And politician-wise, a guy named Barry Goldwater, who's a senator from Arizona for a long time. He's going to run for president in 1964, and he's got a lot of people at the time considered him to be fairly out there in terms of his conservatism, but he's also very attractive to a lot of people who think that he is sort of really telling it like it is, as it were. So the 1950s is kind of the beginning of this rise of a conservative movement, and you need to know that it comes about, again, as a backlash against Eisenhower. People who just look at the Republicans under Eisenhower and say, well, this isn't really that different than the Democrats. The last kind of little segment of stuff that we've got in here deals with the aspect of the 1950s that's very science obsessed. The 50s is a decade that is really interested in the idea of progress and of the future. If you have ever watched the cartoon The Jetsons, like the Space Family, that's a really good, it's from the 1950s originally, and it's actually a really good indicator into kind of how people in the 1950s looked at science. That it was just this sort of magical thing that was going to someday bring us like flying cars and houses where you could push a button in the wall and get a meal, out of a chute, and robot butlers and stuff like that. Right? That was sort of how people saw this, the potential for science. So we have this new nuclear energy. We've got all of these cool new inventions that you see on here. We're like curing polio. We're flying into space. And that there was just this almost sort of boundless interest and enthusiasm for scientific pursuits. But at the same time, there's also a fear of what that potential science could bring to us. We see a real, like, this is 1950s is when like sci-fi becomes a thing. So if you're a fan of like old school science fiction, whether it's, in comic books or whether it's in movie or TV form, most of those date back to the 1950s. There are a lot of people who've done kind of analysis of this. If you look at 1950s sci-fi, in many cases, they're using aliens as a metaphor for communists. They're coming in from the outside, they're infiltrating, they're invading and taking over, secretly from within, that type of thing. And then the real kind of centerpiece of these anxieties did tend to center around the idea of nuclear energy. We're very excited by the idea of nuclear energy and by us having it, but we're also very scared of all of these potential, fallouts that we could have. So in the 1950s, there was a lot of fear that we could potentially be under attack by the Soviet Union. So you see this very famous image of like children in schools practicing duck and cover drills. This poor child right here is clearly going to be the first to die. She's not quite getting this, but the idea was that if you see the flash or there's a nuclear explosion, you get under your desk, and that will definitely protect you. Right? It was all that kind of calming fears. People built like bomb shelters in their backyard, and towns built fallout shelters, and there was a general, concern that the war could potentially be ending. And this sort of weird, giddy veering back and forth between the atomic bomb is this cool thing, and you're going to get your kid an atomic energy lab, to play with, and then at the same time, you should be very scared or potentially afraid of the power of the atomic bomb, is why a lot of times the 1950s is referred to as the atomic age. It's this kind of weird dichotomy of both fear and excitement. The thing that kind of caps off the science explosion of the 1950s is the beginning of the space race. And the space race starts in 1957 when the Soviet Union successfully launches Sputnik. Sputnik is the first man-made satellite to orbit the Earth. So it's the first thing that we shoot up in the air that then goes around the Earth in space. And it really it freaks out a lot of Americans because we are nowhere near being able to do this. We have a space program that is run by the Army and it's trying to do this, but we're not anywhere close. We keep just basically exploding our rockets. And so we're convinced in 1957 basically that we're behind. Today we know that Sputnik was just basically like a beach ball with some weather instruments in it. But at the time, we had no idea. I mean, it could have cameras, it could be spying on us, it could have missiles on it. So we really kind of gear up for science. In 1958, we passed the NDEA, the National Defense Education Act, and what that does is basically revamp science education in K-12. So it used to be if you went to school in high school in the 1950s, the highest science that you could get in a public school would be you could get to maybe some basic biology. The highest you could get to maybe algebra and math, and everything else was university level education. But Sputnik comes along, and our politicians are like, oh, here little Bobby and Susie are, taking their shoes off and dancing to rock and roll in the gym, but over in the Soviet Union, little Ivan and little Ivana are, learning particle physics. And so it's at this point that they restructure the science and math curriculum to include calculus and upper level sciences, chemistry, physics, those kinds of things. So, the next time you're sitting in calc or wherever, you can just think Sputnik. It's all Sputnik's fault. So we're worried about falling behind. And then the other thing that happens, of course, is that the space race really kicks into high gear. So 1957 to about 1969, arguably, the space race is at its height. Eisenhower creates NASA right after Sputnik. Here you can see again in 1958 there. So NASA is a government organization that's sole purpose is to, explore space, basically. The Soviets are winning early on in the space race. They launched the first satellite. They launched the first, dog into space. The first man in space is Yuri Gagarin, right? So Soviet cosmonaut. And then finally in 1969, the United States kind of takes the lead and the final prize by being the first to land man on the moon. So that's the space race that's going to occupy a lot of our attention and fascination in the 1950s and 60s. When Eisenhower leaves office in 1961, he's going to pass the office off to JFK, who we'll talk about next. He warns about something that is pretty important, and that is the domination of what he calls the military industrial complex. And this is basically the ties or the connections between the defense industry and the U.S. economy. And what Eisenhower is warning about is something that is very true, and that is that our economy has become basically dependent on the military to fund it. So the U.S. government pays defense contractors like Lockheed Martin or Boeing lots of money to make goods and weapons for the military, which it essentially buys from them. Those companies, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, et cetera, they provide jobs. So they basically become almost like what we would call today too big to fail. And Eisenhower was concerned that it would sort of lock our economy into a destructive pattern. The College Board really likes to test you on what the military-industrial complex means. I think just because it's something that's still sort of relevant today. When people look at modern day defense contracts, this is something still that definitely gets talked about. But you need to be aware that in Eisenhower's farewell address, the thing that he warns about is this dominance of the military industrial complex, and that's the connection between the economy and the government and the military, basically. So that takes us through the early Cold War, Truman and Eisenhower. And when we pick back up with the next set of notes, we will be looking at John F. Kennedy and his sort of foreign policy and then into the civil rights movement.